Al Lin, are we creating a moral hazard by even having this conversation or doing this research?
I think this is a serious question, right? For years, geoengineering wasn't talked about in scientific circles or in serious policy discussions because I think of this concern that even talking about it would be enough to create this moral hazard. And I think the further we go down the road from raising the issue to perhaps doing research into it, I think we really do have to consider the moral hazard. That is, it's quite unusual that we would spend billions of dollars into researching a technology and developing it and then putting it on the shelf and simply deciding that we would never use it.
We should be looking
at least thinking about it, not necessarily doing it.
But your point is a good one. Is that, I mean, why research something? Eventually, it's going to get used somewhere by someone.
Right. Right. What I'm suggesting is that we can't simply ignore the issue. We can't simply bury our heads in the sand and pretend geoengineering isn't out there or that it isn't something that could assist in dealing with climate change.
Some people say that it's actually fast and cheap, and that the technology exists today. Ken Caldeira, do you think that's true?
I think that if we wanted to, say, put sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere sometime in the next few years, that we could do it. It might be cheap to actually do it, but it's likely that some people will be damaged by doing that. And that damage could be many hundreds of billions of dollars, potentially.
And lives.
And lives. And so, while it might be cheap to do, the consequences of it might not be cheap.
David Whelan, if Boeing wanted to do this today, there's talk about retrofitting 747s. How close is the Boeing to being able to do this today? This being dispersed sulfur via airplanes in the atmosphere.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's thinking serious about doing it, so I caveat that. I think there's a technical feasibility that if you wanted to lift so many megatons of CO2 up to a certain altitude, there are ways to do it ranging from aircraft to get it to 35,000 feet to large cannons to get it up to 150,000 feet. And as Ken says, it's a matter of what do you want to do, and so there's ways to get it there. But I guess what I was alluding to earlier is that we don't understand the implications and the consequences. And so when you look at the risk benefits, we don't understand enough of the risk side of the equation. And I'd argue we're not even sure what the benefit sides are. There may be local benefits, there may be local negatives, so there's winners and losers. And so how do you account for that?
And how do we test that on something that, by definition, to test it, you have to do it on a global scale? And how do you test it without incurring those risks?
Mother Nature has done this for us, whether we liked it or not. So when Mount Pinatubo erupted, it did spur SO2 into the atmosphere, and there was, Ken can probably talk much further in detail about that, but there was an experiment. So I think, us as a nation being prepared to, at a minimum, get ourselves prepared to do all the right instrumentation, all the right measurements, ask the right questions, that if Mother Nature does do another experiment, that we're at least collecting all the right data, asking the right questions, and taking best advantage of whatever natural events occur. That's sort of at a minimum, we ought to be doing that.
Should we mimic hurricanes?
I don't think we should do any of these things now. I think we need to learn more to understand what the risks are. The initial model simulations indicate that there's the potential for risk reduction. And I think if the environment was the only thing we had to worry about, I think from a purely environmental perspective, it's likely that these approaches will reduce risk. I think the question becomes when you introduce these into real social systems, whether when it's embedded in a socio-political system of an armed world, whether it will really reduce overall risk. I mean, we can imagine a situation in which the tropics are heat stressed from global warming, and there's the threat of massive famines throughout the tropical world, and then so you deploy a system like this in order to to make sure that the people living in the tropics can grow their food. And maybe as a result of this, you weaken the Indian monsoon, and as a result, you cause the loss of life and famine in India. And now India is a nuclear-armed nation, and now you've done an act that is, threatening the livelihood and the well-being of a nuclear-armed nation. And so when you bring in all of those kind of military and socio-political feedbacks, whether you can really reduce risk in the real world is a different question than whether you can reduce risk in a climate model.